In Badged-in High School, the late afternoon sun filtered through the classroom windows as Miss Shaw, the beloved English teacher, wrapped up her lesson. Her voice, warm and firm, carried over the students' chatter as she gave them instructions for their homework. Suddenly, Sandra, a notorious troublemaker, snorted loudly. "This is boring," she declared, slamming her book shut. Miss Shaw turned to her with a calm but serious expression. "Sandra, you must learn to respect your elders and focus on your studies." Sandra rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Why should I? You can't tell me what to do." The class went silent, the tension thick in the air. Miss Shaw sighed and walked over to Sandra's desk. Picking up her cane, she tapped Sandra lightly on the hand 3 times. "Discipline is important. You may not understand now, but one day you will thank me." Sandra glared at her with eyes that seemed to burn. She didn't say a word, but her silence was louder than any outburst. That night, something eerie happened. As the city buzzed with life, Sandra slipped away from her home, her steps purposeful as she headed to an abandoned warehouse. Inside, candles flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. A group of figures dressed in dark robes sat in a circle, chanting. Sandra entered and bowed her head. "She humiliated me today," she said, her voice filled with venom. "I want her to suffer." The leader of the group, an older woman with piercing eyes, smiled darkly. "Then it shall be done. The teacher will learn that we are not to be trifled with." Unbeknownst to them, a battle far greater than they anticipated was about to begin. Miss Shaw's life would never be the same. The night after Sandra's secret meeting, Miss Shaw sat alone in her modest city apartment. The warm glow of her table lamp illuminated the stacks of books and papers she had been grading. Her small tabby cat, Mimi, curled up beside her, purring softly. It was a peaceful evening, or so it seemed. As the clock struck midnight, a sudden chill swept through the room. Miss Shaw shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Mimi, who had been half asleep, suddenly perked up. Her ears flattened, and she hissed, staring intently at the corner of the room. "What's wrong, Mimi?" Miss Shaw asked, her voice tinged with concern. She turned to look, but there was nothing there, just shadows cast by the furniture. She dismissed it as the cat being overly sensitive and returned to her papers, though the air in the room felt heavy. Minutes later, a loud thud echoed from the kitchen. Startled, Miss Shaw stood up, her heart racing. She cautiously made her way to the kitchen, flicking on the light. A stack of plates had fallen to the floor, shattered into pieces. Frowning, she wondered how it had happened. She was certain the plates had been securely stacked earlier. She cleaned up the mess, but as she bent down to pick up the shards, she felt an inexplicable sensation, like someone was standing right behind her. Turning quickly, she saw nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Back in the living room, Mimi was nowhere to be found. "Mimi," she called out, her voice echoing slightly. Moments later, she found the cat hiding under the couch, her eyes wide and filled with terror. "Maybe I'm just tired," Miss Shaw whispered to herself, trying to shake off the unease. She turned off the lights and went to bed, hoping to leave the strange events behind. That night, her dreams were far from restful. She found herself walking through an unfamiliar, foggy forest. The trees loomed high, their branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching for her. She tried to find a path, but the more she walked, the denser the fog became. Then, she saw it, a figure in the distance. It was shrouded in darkness, its features indistinct, but its eyes glowed red. The figure didn't move, yet she felt an intense pressure, like it was staring directly into her soul. "Who are you?" Miss Shaw demanded, her voice trembling. The figure raised an arm and pointed at her. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the forest. "You dared to humiliate one of us. You will pay the price." Miss Shaw jolted awake, drenched in sweat. Her heart pounded as she sat up, clutching her chest. It was just a dream, she told herself, but it felt too real. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was 3 a.m. The hour she'd heard was spiritually significant. She reached for her Bible on the nightstand, her fingers trembling. Flipping it open, she began to pray aloud. her voice quivering but determined. As she prayed, she felt a strange warmth wash over her, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to lift slightly. The next morning, Miss Shah arrived at school looking pale and exhausted. Her colleagues noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" asked Mr. Kofi, the math teacher. "You don't look like yourself today." "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just a rough night." In her classroom, the students were noisier than usual. Sandra sat at the back, her gaze fixed on Miss Shah, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Miss Shah avoided eye contact, feeling an unspoken tension. Throughout the day, small, unsettling incidents continued. A gust of wind blew open the classroom windows, scattering papers everywhere, even though the weather outside was calm. Her pen rolled off the desk repeatedly, as if pushed by an invisible hand, and Sandra's smirk seemed to grow with every incident. By the time the final bell rang, Miss Shah was drained, both physically and emotionally. She packed up her things and headed home, her mind clouded with unease. That evening, Miss Shah decided to visit her elderly neighbor, Mama F. Known for her wisdom and deep spirituality, Mama F was respected throughout the neighborhood. If anyone could make sense of the strange occurrences, it was her. Sitting in Mama F's small, cozy living room, Miss Shah recounted everything: the dream, the strange happenings, and even Sandra's behavior. Mama F listened intently, her face grave. When Miss Shah finished, she nodded slowly. "My dear, this is no ordinary trouble. You are under spiritual attack." Miss Shah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "There are forces in this world that operate in darkness," Mama F explained. "Sometimes, jealousy, anger, or hatred can open doors for these forces to act. This student of yours, Sandra, she is involved in things no child should ever be part of." Miss Shah felt a chill run down her spine. "What should I do?" "You must pray," Mama F said firmly. "Pray like you have never prayed before, and I will pray with you. But remember, this is not a battle you can fight alone. You need divine intervention." Miss Shah left Mama F's house that night with a newfound resolve. She knew the days ahead would be challenging, but she was determined not to let fear consume her. Little did she know, the battle had only just begun. While Miss Shah sought spiritual guidance from Mama F, Sandra was preparing to escalate her plans. That night, as the city of Badge Din fell into its usual rhythm of activity, Sandra slipped away once again. She walked quickly through the dimly lit streets, her face expressionless, her mind focused on the task ahead. The abandoned warehouse loomed in the distance like a dark sentinel. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of burning herbs and candles. A group of shadowy figures sat in a circle, their faces partially obscured by hoods. Sandra entered and took her place among them. The leader of the coven, a tall woman with a commanding presence, stepped forward. Her name was Madame Anaka, and her reputation for wielding dark powers was well known among those in the spiritual underworld. "What have you brought us tonight, Sandra?" Madame Anaka asked, her voice low and cold. Sandra hesitated for a moment before pulling out a folded piece of paper. On it was Miss Shah's name, written in bold letters. "This is her name," Sandra said, her voice laced with bitterness. "She humiliated me in front of everyone. I want her to suffer, to regret ever crossing me." Madame Anaka unfolded the paper, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "Humiliation is a powerful emotion. It feeds the energy we need. But you must understand, child, there is a cost to everything." "I don't care about the cost," Sandra replied sharply. "Just make her pay." The other members of the coven began to chant softly, their voices blending into an eerie harmony. Madame Anaka placed the paper into a small clay pot, along with a handful of strange powders and herbs. She lit a match and dropped it into the pot, which erupted into a bright blue flame. "By the power of the unseen, we send this message," Madame Anaka intoned. "To the one who has offended us, we send chaos, pain, and fear. Let her peace be taken, her strength broken, her heart filled with despair." The flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Sandra watched with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She didn't fully understand the depth of what she was involved in, but her anger blinded her to the potential consequences. "Your teacher will feel our power," Madame Anaka said, her voice filled with certainty. "But remember, Sandra, this is no game. Once the door to the spiritual world is opened, it is not easily closed." Sandra nodded, though deep down, a sliver of fear began to creep into her heart. Meanwhile, Miss Shah sat in her living room, clutching her Bible tightly. Following Mama F's advice, she had spent hours in prayer. The heaviness that had plagued her home seemed to lift slightly, but the unease lingered. As she read through the Psalms, a sudden wave of exhaustion hit her. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing involuntarily. It was then that she saw it again, the shadow from her dream. This time, it was clearer. The figure stood in the doorway of her living room, motionless but menacing. "Who are you?" Miss Shah demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The shadow didn't reply. Instead, it seemed to grow larger, its darkness spreading across the room. Miss Shah gripped her Bible tighter, her heart pounding. "In the name of Jesus, I command you to leave," she shouted. The shadow hesitated, as if struggling against an unseen force. Then, slowly, it began to recede, disappearing into the wall. Miss Shah gasped for air, her hands shaking. She knew this was only the beginning. Back at the warehouse, Sandra and the coven were finishing their ritual. Madame Anaka looked at Sandra with a piercing gaze. "It is done," she said. "But remember, child, there are rules even we must follow. Do not let your emotions cloud your judgment. If you overreach, the consequences will fall on you as well." Sandra nodded, but her mind was already racing. She didn't care about rules or consequences. All she wanted was to see Miss Shah suffer. As the group disbanded, Sandra walked home alone, the weight of the night's events pressing on her. The streets were eerily quiet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. When she finally reached her home, Sandra collapsed onto her bed, exhausted. But sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, her dreams filled with strange, haunting images, dark figures chasing her, whispers calling her name, and the faint image of Miss Shah standing in a field of light, surrounded by a golden glow. Sandra woke with a start, her heart racing. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Had she made a mistake? Little did she know, her actions had set into motion a chain of events that would not only test Miss Shah's faith, but also force Sandra to confront the very darkness she had unleashed. The next morning, Miss Shah woke up feeling unusually drained. Her body ached as though she had been carrying a heavy burden all night. Even simple tasks, like getting out of bed, felt like monumental efforts. Still, her sense of duty pushed her forward. She dressed and made her way to Badge Den High School, determined to maintain her routine. The school hallways bustled with students, but as Miss Shah walked through them, she felt an unnatural heaviness, as though an invisible cloud followed her. By the time she entered her classroom, a sharp headache had taken hold. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The students, usually responsive and cheerful, sensed her discomfort and murmured greetings. Sandra sat at the back, her face unreadable. As Miss Shah tried to begin the lesson, her vision blurred, and she stumbled slightly. "Miss Shah, are you okay?" one of the students asked. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." But she wasn't fine. By lunchtime, her condition had worsened. Her hands trembled, and her skin felt clammy. Her colleague, Mr. Kofi, found her sitting in the staff room, her head resting on the table. "Shah, you don't look well," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You should see a doctor." Miss Shah nodded weakly and decided to leave school early. As she made her way home, the journey felt interminable. Her steps were slow, her legs heavy. By the time she reached her apartment, she collapsed onto her couch, her heart racing. The next day, Miss Shah visited the local clinic. The doctor ran several tests but found nothing out of the ordinary. "You seem healthy, Miss Shah," he said. "Perhaps you're just overworked. Get some rest, and you should feel better." But rest didn't help. Over the next few days, her condition deteriorated. She could barely eat or sleep, and an inexplicable fear gripped her heart. At night, She felt the same oppressive presence in her room, watching her, waiting. Sandra, meanwhile, was beginning to notice changes in herself as well. The mark on her hand, which had appeared during the ritual, began to itch and burn. At first, she dismissed it, thinking it was a minor irritation. But by the third day, the mark had turned a deep, unnatural black, and strange sensations coursed through her body. At school, her behavior became erratic. She snapped at her friends and isolated herself during breaks. The satisfaction she had once felt from the coven's actions was now replaced with a growing unease. That night, she sat alone in her room, staring at the mark. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, and faint whispers filled the air. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Miss Shaw's situation worsened further. One evening, she collapsed while trying to prepare dinner. Lying on the floor, she whispered a desperate prayer. "God, if this is an attack, please help me. I can't do this alone." As she lay there, her phone buzzed. It was Mama F. "Shaw, I've been praying for you," Mama F said, her voice urgent. "I feel a strong force of darkness around you. You need more than prayer. You need to fight back spiritually. Come to my house tomorrow. We'll pray together." Despite her weakness, Miss Shaw agreed. The next day, she made her way to Mama F's house, each step feeling like a monumental effort. When she arrived, Mama F greeted her with a concerned expression. "My dear, you've been carrying a heavy burden," she said. "But you're not alone. Let us call on the one who is greater than any force of darkness." They sat together in the small living room, and Mama F began to pray. Her voice was powerful, filled with authority. As she prayed, Miss Shaw felt a warmth begin to spread through her body, pushing back the cold heaviness that had gripped her for days. "You must continue praying on your own," Mama F said when they finished. "This is not just about you. Someone has targeted you, and they're using powers from the dark world. But remember, light always triumphs over darkness." Miss Shaw nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. That night, as Sandra prepared to attend another meeting at the warehouse, she hesitated. The mark on her hand was now throbbing, and her reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. Her eyes looked darker, her face hollow. When she arrived at the warehouse, Madame Anaka immediately noticed her condition. "You've been careless," Madame Anaka said sternly. "You're letting fear creep in, and it's weakening you. Do you want this mission to fail?" Sandra shook her head. "No, but—" "No buts," Madame Anaka interrupted. "You must stay focused. The teacher is weakening, but if you falter, the consequences will fall on you." Sandra nodded, but doubt lingered in her heart. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that she was spiraling into something far darker than she had anticipated. As the night's ritual began, Sandra's unease grew. The chants seemed louder, harsher, and the shadows in the room felt alive. For the first time, she questioned whether this path was worth the price she was paying. Little did she know, her actions were setting the stage for a battle that would change both her and Miss Shaw's lives forever. Miss Shaw returned home from Mama F's house feeling lighter, but the invisible battle surrounding her was far from over. That night, she decided to stay awake and pray, determined to reclaim her peace. With her Bible open on her lap, she read aloud the verses that Mama F had recommended. As she prayed, the room grew colder, and the familiar oppressive presence crept back in. This time, however, Miss Shaw refused to be paralyzed by fear. She stood up and began to pray louder, her voice filled with resolve. "In the name of Jesus, I bind every spirit of darkness operating against me," she declared. Her voice shook slightly, but her determination only grew. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to thicken. Her tabby cat, Mimi, bolted under the couch, hissing in terror. Miss Shaw continued praying, her words unwavering despite the growing tension in the room. Then it happened. A glass vase on the table shattered without warning, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. Miss Shaw's heart raced, but she didn't stop. "You have no power here," she shouted. "I am a child of God, and his light drives out all darkness." For a moment, the room fell silent. The oppressive presence seemed to hesitate, then receded like a tide pulled back by a greater force. The air became still, and a sense of peace began to fill the space. Miss Shah sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had felt the darkness retreat, but she knew this was only a skirmish in a larger battle. At the same time, in a dimly lit alley near the abandoned warehouse, Sandra walked briskly toward the coven's meeting place. Her hand throbbed with pain, and a deep sense of dread gnawed at her. The mark on her palm now pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. When she arrived, Madame Anaka and the other members were already gathered, their faces grim. "She's fighting back," Madame Anaka said without preamble. "Your teacher is stronger than we anticipated." Sandra swallowed hard. What does that mean? Will the ritual fail? Madame Anaka glared at her. It means the battle is no longer in your hands alone. By fighting back with prayer, she has summoned forces of light. We will need to escalate our efforts, or you will face the consequences of failure. Sandra's stomach churned. The weight of her decisions was becoming unbearable. She had never imagined it would come to this. That night's ritual was more intense than any Sandra had participated in before. The chants were louder, the air heavier with incense and smoke. Madame Anaka led the group, her voice commanding and filled with malice. "We call upon the ancient powers," she intoned, her hands raised. "Bring confusion, destruction, and despair upon our enemy. Let her strength wither, and her light be extinguished." Sandra watched as the flames in the center of the room rose higher, twisting unnaturally. For a brief moment, she thought she saw faces in the fire. Dark, angry faces, glaring at her. As the ritual concluded, Sandra felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and dread. She staggered out of the warehouse, clutching her hand. The mark was now searing hot, and tears filled her eyes. "What have I done?" she whispered into the night. The next morning, Miss Shah felt a strange energy within her. Though her body was still weak, her spirit was stronger than ever. She spent the day praying and reading, filling her mind and heart with faith. That afternoon, Mama F visited her, bringing along 2 other women from her prayer group. "Shah, we're here to stand with you," Mama F said. "This is not a battle you can fight alone. Together, we will call upon God to break every chain holding you captive." The women began to pray, their voices harmonizing in a powerful chorus. As they prayed, Miss Shah felt a warmth spread through her apartment, like a shield of light pushing back the darkness. Sandra, on the other hand, was unraveling. The mark on her hand had spread, forming strange patterns up her wrist. Her nights were plagued by nightmares, and even during the day, she heard whispers that no one else could hear. At school, she could barely focus. Her classmates noticed her withdrawn demeanor, and even her closest friends began to avoid her. That evening, as she prepared to return to the warehouse, she stopped herself. She couldn't go back, not after what she had seen and felt. Instead, she locked herself in her room and tried to sleep, but the nightmares returned with a vengeance. In her dream, she stood in a vast, empty field. A storm raged above her, and the ground beneath her feet was cracked and dry. In the distance, she saw Miss Shah, surrounded by a brilliant light. Sandra tried to move toward her, but shadowy figures rose from the ground, blocking her path. "You can't escape," a voice whispered in her ear. Sandra woke with a scream, her entire body drenched in sweat. For the first time, she realized she was no longer in control. Miss Shah continued to pray with Mama F and her prayer group every evening. Slowly, her strength began to return, and the oppressive atmosphere in her apartment lifted completely. One night, as they prayed, Mama F suddenly stopped and looked at Miss Shah. "The battle is shifting," she said. "Whoever is behind this is beginning to feel the consequences of their actions. But you must remain vigilant. Do not let your guard down, even for a moment." Miss Shah nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew she was no longer fighting alone. Unbeknownst to her, Sandra was reaching her breaking point. The darkness she had unleashed was no longer under her control, and the consequences were about to reach a boiling point. Sandra spent the next few days in isolation, afraid of what was happening to her. The mark on her hand now extended up her arm, glowing faintly in the dark. She avoided school, claiming she was unwell, but in truth, she was terrified. The voices in her head had grown louder, and her dreams had become vivid nightmares that left her gasping for air each morning. One night, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. Sandra pulled out her phone and called Madame Anaka. "I can't do this anymore," Sandra said, her voice shaky. "Something is wrong. The mark, it's spreading. I hear things, see things. I didn't sign up for this." Madame Anaka's voice was calm but firm. "I warned you, child. The spiritual world is not a place for the faint of heart. You've opened a door, and now you must see it through. If you abandon the mission, the darkness will turn on you." Sandra's stomach churned. "But what do I do? It feels like I'm losing myself." "You must strengthen your resolve," Madame Anaka replied. "Come to the warehouse tomorrow night. We'll conduct a cleansing ritual to stabilize your energy." Sandra reluctantly agreed, but deep down, she knew she was walking a dangerous line. Meanwhile, Miss Shah was finding strength in her growing faith. The prayers with Mama F and her group had bolstered her spirit, and she no longer felt the oppressive weight that had plagued her. However, she wasn't naive. She knew the battle wasn't over. During her prayers one evening, Miss Shah had a vision. She saw Sandra, her face pale and filled with fear, standing at a crossroads. In the vision, one path led to light, while the other descended into darkness. Miss Shah woke from the vision with a sense of urgency. "Lord," she prayed, "help me to reach her. I don't know what she's facing, but I feel she's caught in something beyond her control." The next night, Sandra reluctantly made her way to the warehouse. The atmosphere inside was heavier than usual. Madame Anaka and the other members were already chanting, their voices echoing eerily. Sandra hesitated at the entrance, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but fear kept her rooted in place. "Come in," Madame Anaka said, gesturing to her. Sandra stepped forward, her legs trembling. The others formed a circle around her, and Madame Anaka began the ritual. She placed her hands on Sandra's shoulders, chanting in a language Sandra didn't recognize. At first, Sandra felt a strange warmth, but it quickly turned into searing pain. She cried out, but the chanting grew louder, drowning out her voice. The mark on her arm burned, and her vision blurred. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The chanting stopped abruptly, and a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the warehouse. "What is that?" Sandra screamed, her eyes darting around the darkened room. Madame Anaka's face was pale. "Something is wrong. There's interference." Before anyone could react, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and writhing. The figure spoke in a voice that sent chills through everyone present. "You meddle in forces you cannot control," it said, its tone mocking and menacing. The coven members froze, their fear palpable. Madame Anaka attempted to banish the entity, chanting and throwing powders into the air, but the figure only laughed. "This one," it said, pointing at Sandra, "belongs to me now." Sandra fell to her knees, clutching her chest. She felt as though her very soul was being pulled from her body. "Help me!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. But no one moved. The members of the coven began to scatter, their courage failing them. Even Madame Anaka stepped back, her usual confidence replaced with fear. Sandra's vision dimmed, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. Just before she passed out, she heard a voice, soft but firm, cutting through the chaos. At that exact moment, Miss Shah woke from a deep sleep, her heart racing. She felt an overwhelming urge to pray, as though someone's life depended on it. She knelt by her bed and began to intercede, her voice filled with urgency. "Father, wherever she is, cover her with your protection. Break every chain holding her captive. Let your light shine in her darkness." As she prayed, a warm glow filled her room, and a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't know it yet, but her prayers were reaching Sandra in her darkest hour. Sandra woke up hours later, lying on the cold floor of the warehouse. The room was empty, the candles extinguished, and the air still. She felt weak but alive. For the first time in weeks, the voices in her head were silent. She struggled to her feet and stumbled out of the warehouse, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't continue down this path. Back at home, Miss Shah felt a deep sense of relief. Though she didn't fully understand what had happened, she knew her prayers had made a difference. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope for Sandra and for Miss Shah's continued fight against the forces of darkness. The next morning, Sandra woke up in her room, her body aching and her mind clouded with fear. The events at the warehouse played over and over in her head. She felt broken, as though the darkness she had called upon was consuming her from the inside. Staring at the mark on her arm, which now resembled a black vine twisting up to her shoulder, she made a decision. She had to seek help. For the first time, she considered that the only way out was to turn to someone who could fight the spiritual battle she couldn't handle alone. Sandra thought of Miss Shah. Despite everything, she felt a strange connection to her teacher, a connection she didn't understand. At school, Sandra arrived late, her face pale and her steps hesitant. She walked into Miss Shah's classroom, avoiding the stares of her classmates. As soon as the bell rang for lunch, Sandra stayed behind, waiting for the classroom to empty. Miss Shah noticed her lingering. "Sandra, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone gentle. Sandra's lips quivered, and she struggled to hold back tears. "Miss Shah, I need to talk to you." Miss Shah nodded, gesturing for Sandra to sit. Once the door was shut, Sandra began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've done something terrible," she said, her hands trembling. I got involved with people I shouldn't have. I wanted revenge, but now it's out of control." Miss Shah's heart sank as she listened. She had suspected spiritual interference, but hearing Sandra's confession made it all too real. "What kind of people?" Miss Shah asked softly. Sandra hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as though she feared someone might hear. "They're witches. They helped me cast something on you because I was angry, but now they've turned on me. I feel like I'm trapped in something I can't escape." Miss Shah took a deep breath, her mind racing. "Sandra, this is serious. You've opened doors to darkness, but it's not too late. You need help, spiritual help." Tears streamed down Sandra's face. "I don't know what to do. I'm scared. They said if I try to leave, something terrible will happen to me." Miss Shah reached out and held Sandra's hands, ignoring the faint heat radiating from the black mark on her arm. "Sandra, you came to the right place. God's light is stronger than any darkness, but you have to make a choice. Do you want to break free from this?" Sandra nodded, her sobs shaking her body. "Yes, but I don't think I'm strong enough." "You don't have to be strong alone," Miss Shah said. "I'll help you, and so will others who understand this battle. But first, you have to renounce everything you've been part of and commit to turning away from it completely." Sandra hesitated. The memories of Madame Anaka's threats haunted her, but so did the vision of the shadowy figure claiming her. She nodded again, this time with more resolve. "I'll do it." That evening, Sandra and Miss Shah went to Mama F's house. Sandra was nervous, her heart pounding as they entered the warm, prayer-filled home. Mama F greeted them, her expression a mix of kindness and urgency. "So, this is the girl," she said, studying Sandra with knowing eyes. "Child, you've walked into a dangerous world, but God's mercy is greater than your mistakes." Sandra felt a mixture of fear and relief as she sat down. Mama F and two other prayer warriors joined them, forming a circle around Sandra. "Before we begin, you must confess and renounce everything you've done," Mama F said. "Say it with your own mouth, and break any agreements you've made with the enemy." Sandra hesitated, her voice trembling as she began to speak. I joined a group of witches. I went to their meetings, performed their rituals. I wanted to hurt Miss Shah because I thought she was unfair to me. But now, I want out. I renounce all of it. I don't want anything to do with them anymore." As Sandra spoke, the mark on her arm began to burn. She cried out in pain, clutching her arm, but Mama F was unmoved. "Keep speaking," Mama F urged. "The enemy doesn't let go easily, but you have the authority to break free." Sandra continued, her voice growing stronger. With each word, the burning sensation lessened, and a sense of lightness began to fill her heart. The prayer warriors began to pray fervently, their voices rising in unison. Sandra felt a pressure building inside her, as though something was fighting to stay within her. She screamed, her body convulsing, but Miss Shah held her hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement. "You are free," Miss Shah said firmly. "God's light is in you now." Suddenly, Sandra let out a final, ear-piercing scream, and the pressure inside her released. She collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face, but the mark on her arm had faded to a faint outline. "It's done," Mama F said, her voice calm but resolute. "The chains have been broken, but the battle isn't over. Sandra, you must commit yourself to prayer and righteousness. If you return to the darkness, it will come back stronger." Sandra nodded, exhausted but relieved. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. As they left Mama F's house, Miss Shah looked at Sandra with a gentle smile. "This is a new beginning for you, Sandra. It won't be easy, but you're not alone. I'll be here to guide you." Sandra nodded, her heart filled with gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to walk a new path, no matter how difficult it might be. Little did they know, however, that the coven wasn't finished. Madame Anaka had felt the break in her connection to Sandra and was already planning her next move. The true battle was only beginning. The night after Sandra's deliverance, a storm rolled over Badge Den City. Thunder rumbled, and lightning illuminated the streets, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance in the rain. In the warehouse, Madame Anaka sat surrounded by her dwindling coven. The loss of Sandra had weakened their spiritual power, and the entity they served was displeased. "She betrayed us," Madame Anaka spat, pacing the room. "I warned her, and yet she turned to them." Her eyes glowed with anger. "Miss Shah, she's the one who interfered." One of the witches, an older man with a raspy voice, spoke up. "The teacher is strong, and now she has allies. We should retreat before this brings destruction on us." Madame Anaka turned sharply to face him. "Retreat? Never. We are not powerless. Sandra may have slipped through our fingers, but this teacher and her prayer group will regret challenging us." With that, Madame Anaka raised her hands, chanting incantations that filled the room with a dark, pulsating energy. Shadows writhed along the walls, and the air grew thick with malevolence. "We'll strike back," she declared, her voice echoing unnaturally. "If they want a battle, they'll get one." The nightmares return. That night, Miss Shah was woken by a chilling sound, a faint scratching at her bedroom window. She sat up, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again. Slowly, she got out of bed and approached the window. When she drew back the curtain, her breath caught. Outside on the glass was a handprint. It was black, as though burned into the surface. Miss Shah felt a cold dread wash over her, but she quickly composed herself. "No fear," she whispered to herself. "God has not given me a spirit of fear." She knelt by her bed and began to pray, her voice firm and steady. As she prayed, the oppressive atmosphere in the room began to lift, but she knew this was only the beginning. At the same time, Sandra was tossing and turning in her bed. Her dreams were chaotic, flashes of fire, shadowy figures, and Madame Anaka's piercing eyes. In the dream, she was back in the warehouse, surrounded by the coven. "You thought you could escape?" Madame Anaka sneered, her voice echoing. "You belong to us, and we'll take back what's ours." Sandra screamed in the dream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Clutching the Bible Miss Shah had given her, Sandra whispered a prayer. "God, please help me. I don't want to go back to that life." A meeting of forces. The next day, Miss Shah and Mama F met at the prayer group's small meeting hall. Sandra joined them, her face pale but determined. "They're retaliating," Miss Shah said, recounting the strange handprint and the oppressive feeling she had felt the night before. "I can sense it. This isn't over." Mama F nodded, her expression grave. "Of course it isn't. The enemy doesn't let go without a fight. But we are not fighting alone. Sandra, How are you feeling? Sandra hesitated. I had a nightmare. Madame Anaka was there. She said I couldn't escape. I'm scared she's right. Mama F placed a reassuring hand on Sandra's shoulder. Fear is their greatest weapon, but you are no longer under their authority. You have renounced them and stepped into the light. Now, we must strengthen you spiritually. Prayer and fasting will be your shield. Sandra nodded, though fear still lingered in her eyes. The battle escalates. That night, the prayer group gathered in Miss Shah's apartment, sensing the urgency of the battle ahead. As they prayed, they felt the presence of God's power fill the room, but they also sensed the darkness pushing back. At the same time, Madame Anaka and her coven were deep in their own rituals. They summoned all their remaining strength, calling on their dark forces to attack Miss Shah and her allies. A clash of spiritual forces ensued, unseen to the human eye but felt deeply by those involved. Miss Shah felt her body grow heavy as she prayed, as though an invisible weight was pressing down on her. Sandra began to cry out, clutching her head as the remnants of her past affiliations tried to pull her back. But the prayer warriors didn't falter. Mama F's voice rose above the others, commanding the darkness to flee in the name of Jesus. One by one, the oppressive forces began to retreat, their hold weakening under the power of the group's prayers. The aftermath. By the time the prayer session ended, the atmosphere in the room was clear and peaceful. Sandra, though exhausted, felt a newfound sense of freedom. You're making progress, Mama F said, smiling at her. The battle isn't over, but tonight was a victory. Miss Shah nodded, but her thoughts were still with Madame Anaka and the coven. She knew they wouldn't give up easily, and she needed to prepare for whatever came next. Back in the warehouse, Madame Anaka sat alone, her coven members scattered. The ritual had failed, and her connection to the entity she served was weakening. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, her eyes burning with anger. I'll find another way. But deep down, even Madame Anaka felt the cracks forming in her once unshakable confidence. The light was stronger than she had anticipated, and for the first time, she wondered if her powers would be enough to win this battle. The next morning, Miss Shah woke up early, feeling a strange mix of peace and foreboding. The events of the previous night had left her spiritually drained, but she was resolute. She spent time in prayer, asking for wisdom and protection, knowing the battle with Madame Anaka wasn't over. At school, Sandra arrived looking more composed than she had in weeks. The faint outline of the mark on her arm was still visible, but it no longer burned or caused her distress. She sought out Miss Shah during the lunch break. Miss Shah, I think I'm ready to tell the truth, Sandra said. Miss Shah looked at her with a mixture of concern and encouragement. What truth, Sandra? About Madame Anaka and the coven. They need to be stopped, Sandra said, her voice trembling but determined. They'll just keep doing this to other people if no one stands up to them. Miss Shah nodded thoughtfully. It's brave of you to want to take this step, Sandra, but it's dangerous too. Exposing them might provoke them further. Are you sure you're ready? Sandra hesitated, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack. I'm scared, but I know it's the right thing to do. I can't let them hurt anyone else. Miss Shah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're not alone in this. Let's pray for guidance and protection before we do anything. That evening, Sandra and Miss Shah visited Mama F to discuss their next steps. Sandra shared everything she knew about the coven, their meetings, rituals, and Madame Anaka's role as their leader. They operate in secrecy, but they're growing bolder, Sandra said. I think Madame Anaka is desperate now that I've left. Mama F listened intently, her face stern. These are dangerous waters, but you're right. They need to be exposed. The darkness thrives in secrecy. Bringing it into the light is the first step to breaking their power. Sandra looked nervous. But how? If I tell anyone, they'll think I'm crazy, or worse, they'll come after me. You don't need to do this alone, Mama F said. We'll help you. But first, we need to pray for a divine strategy. This isn't just a physical battle, it's spiritual. That night, the prayer group gathered again, this time focused on seeking wisdom for their next move. As they prayed, a sense of clarity began to fill the room. Mama F spoke, her voice steady and certain. We'll expose them, but not by our own strength. We'll rely on God's timing and direction. Sandra, your testimony will be a powerful weapon, but we must move carefully. Miss Shah added, and while we prepare, we must stay vigilant. Madame Anaka won't sit idly by. Sandra nodded, feeling a mix of fear and resolve. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, a fight for freedom, not just for her but for others who might be trapped in the same darkness. Back at the warehouse, Madame Anaka was fuming. She had felt the spiritual power of Miss Shah's prayers and knew her influence was waning. The entity she served had grown restless, demanding results. "You failed me," the shadowy figure hissed, its voice reverberating through the warehouse. Madame Anaka knelt before it, trembling. "I'll fix this. Give me one more chance." The figure's form shifted, its eyes glowing ominously. "You have one last opportunity. Destroy the girl and the teacher, or face the consequences." Determined to reclaim her power, Madame Anaka began crafting a more potent spell, one that would target both Miss Shah and Sandra directly. "This time," she muttered, "they won't escape." The next day, Sandra found an anonymous note slipped into her locker. The paper was old and worn, the handwriting uneven and hurried. "Be careful. They are watching you. Don't walk alone at night." Her hands shook as she read the message. She looked around the hallway, but no one seemed to be paying attention to her. She stuffed the note into her bag and hurried to Miss Shah's classroom. "Miss Shah, someone left this for me," Sandra said, handing her the note. Miss Shah read it, her expression darkening. "It's a warning. Someone knows what's going on and is trying to protect you." "But who? And how do they know?" Sandra asked. Miss Shah shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to stay alert. No walking alone, no staying out late. And if anything feels off, you call me immediately." That evening, as Sandra walked home with her Bible in hand, the air around her grew unnaturally cold. She felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as though someone, or something, was watching her. She quickened her pace, but the feeling didn't go away. Suddenly, the streetlights flickered, and a shadow darted across her path. Sandra froze, clutching her Bible tightly. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. A low, guttural laugh echoed around her, and the shadow began to take shape. It was a dark, humanoid figure, its eyes glowing red. "You thought you could leave us?" the figure hissed. Sandra screamed, but before the figure could move closer, she shouted, "Jesus, help me!" In an instant, a blinding light surrounded her, and the shadow shrieked, dissipating into the night. Sandra fell to her knees, shaking and crying. When she arrived home, she immediately called Miss Shah, who rushed over with Mama F. "They're getting desperate," Mama F said, her tone grave. "But you called on the right name, Sandra. That's why they couldn't harm you." Miss Shah hugged Sandra tightly. "This proves how strong your faith is becoming. But it also shows that the battle is intensifying." Sandra wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. "I'm not giving up. No matter what they try, I won't go back." Unbeknownst to them, Madame Anaka had felt the failure of her attack. Her frustration grew, but so did her determination to strike harder. For her, the war was far from over. In the dark confines of the warehouse, Madame Anaka knelt before a massive altar adorned with symbols of her craft. Candles flickered as her voice echoed through the dim room. Her coven was smaller now, but those who remained were loyal and as desperate as she was. She raised a bowl filled with blood and ash, chanting incantations in a language older than time. The room grew cold as a shadowy figure emerged, its form towering over her. "You failed me again, Anaka," the figure hissed, its voice like nails scraping on metal. "Give me another chance." Madame Anaka pleaded, her voice trembling. "The girl is slipping away, but the teacher, she's the one keeping her strong. If I take her down, the girl will crumble." The figure tilted its head, glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Very well, but this time, you will give more. A greater sacrifice is required." Madame Anaka hesitated, knowing what the entity demanded. Her soul grew heavy as she nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Then go," the entity commanded. "Strike at the heart of her faith." With renewed determination, Madame Anaka rose, her face hardened. This was her last chance to regain control, and she would stop at nothing. At school, Miss Shah began noticing small, unsettling changes. Her classroom felt colder than usual, and the children were more restless, as though an unseen force was agitating them. Sandra, too, felt the tension. She stayed close to Miss Shah, refusing to walk home alone or linger in the halls. Though her faith was growing, fear lingered in the back of her mind. During their lunch break, Miss Shah and Sandra met in a small chapel near the school to pray. The quiet space, filled with the scent of old wood and candles, brought a sense of calm to them both. "We need to stay strong," Miss Shah said, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. "The enemy is trying to intimidate us, but greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world." Sandra nodded, her grip tightening on her Bible. "I feel like they're watching me everywhere I go, but I won't give in." "Good," Miss Shah said with a faint smile. "Your faith is your weapon. Keep using it." That evening, as Sandra and Miss Shah left the chapel, the air grew unnaturally still. The streets were eerily quiet, with no cars or pedestrians in sight. "I don't like this," Miss Shah murmured, her eyes scanning their surroundings. Before Sandra could respond, a sudden gust of wind whipped past them, carrying with it a sinister whisper. The streetlights flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. "Stay close to me," Miss Shah said, gripping Sandra's arm. Out of the shadows, 3 figures emerged, members of Madame Anaka's coven. They surrounded Miss Shah and Sandra, their faces hidden by hoods, but their intentions were clear. "You should have stayed out of this," one of them said, their voice dripping with malice. Miss Shah stepped forward, her voice steady. "In the name of Jesus, I command you to leave us alone." The figures laughed, their voices echoing unnaturally. "Your prayers won't save you this time," another one sneered. Suddenly, one of the figures raised their hand, and a dark, swirling energy shot toward Miss Shah. She raised her Bible, and the energy dissipated with a loud crack, sending the attacker stumbling backward. Sandra screamed, clutching her Bible tightly. She remembered what Mama F had told her. "Your words have power. Speak them boldly. Leave us alone." Sandra shouted. "We are covered by the blood of Jesus." A blinding light burst forth from her Bible, throwing the attackers to the ground. They writhed and screamed as the light consumed them, their forms dissolving into nothingness. When the light faded, the street was silent again. Sandra and Miss Shah stood frozen, their hearts pounding. They hurried back to Mama F's house, where they recounted the attack to the prayer group. "This is escalating faster than I thought," Mama F said, her face grim. "Madame Anaka is desperate. She's pulling out all the stops." Miss Shah nodded. "We need to stay ahead of her. Sandra and I can't do this alone. We'll increase our prayers and fasting," Mama F said, "and we'll gather more warriors to stand with us. This is a battle for the soul of this city, not just Sandra's life." Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. She had never realized how deeply entrenched the darkness was in Badge Den City. But she also felt a spark of hope. "I'll fight," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, I'll fight." Miss Shah smiled at her, pride and admiration shining in her eyes. "You're stronger than you know, Sandra, and you're not fighting alone." Back at the warehouse, Madame Anaka raged. She had felt the failure of her coven's ambush and the power of the light that had defeated them. "You think you've won?" she hissed into the darkness. "This is far from over." The shadowy figure reappeared, its form more menacing than before. "Your time is running out, Anaka. Either you deliver, or I will take what is mine." Madame Anaka bowed her head, her voice trembling. "I'll deliver. The teacher and the girl will fall." But deep down, even Madame Anaka knew her grip on power was slipping, and the light she sought to destroy was growing stronger. The war was far from over, and both sides were preparing for the next confrontation. The stakes were higher than ever, and the true battle for the soul of Badge Den City was only beginning. The days following the ambush were tense. Miss Shah, Sandra, and Mama F gathered every evening to pray, seeking guidance and strength. The attacks from Madame Anaka's coven were becoming more frequent, but the prayer group's spiritual defenses grew stronger with each battle. Sandra, now more confident in her faith, continued to stand firm, but the pressure weighed heavily on her. One evening, as they gathered in the prayer circle, Mama F spoke with urgency. God has shown me something. There is a deeper connection between Madame Anaka and the entity she serves. This isn't just a fight against a coven. It's a battle against a powerful spiritual force that has been entrenched in this city for generations. Miss Shah frowned. What do you mean, Mama F? I mean that Madame Anaka isn't just a witch. She's been chosen to act as a vessel for a dark force that has been manipulating people in this city for centuries. The darkness in this city isn't just local. It's spiritual, rooted in the very ground we stand on. And that entity has its eyes set on this generation. Sandra swallowed hard, her stomach turning at the thought. So, we're not just fighting witches? No, Mama F said, her voice steady but heavy with gravity. We're fighting a force that has been controlling this city for years. It's why Madame Anaka's power is so strong. It's not just her own strength. She's a conduit for something much greater. But God has given us authority to break it. Sandra's eyes widened. How do we fight something like that? Miss Shah placed her hand gently on Sandra's shoulder. We do what we've been doing. We pray. We stay in God's word. We believe in his power to overcome. The enemy's strength lies in fear and secrecy. When we bring it to the light, it loses its power. Mama F nodded in agreement. And we're not alone. The enemy may seem powerful, but we have the greatest force on our side, God himself. Our faith will bring victory, but we need to pray with authority. It's time to go deeper, to seek God's will for this city and this fight. As the days went by, a sense of urgency began to mount. The attacks grew bolder, and the atmosphere in Badge Den City felt heavier. Sandra noticed people around her becoming more irritable, fearful, and suspicious. It was as if the entire city was being consumed by the dark force that had taken root. One afternoon, as she walked home from school, she saw a strange sight. A group of people had gathered around a street corner, and they were chanting in unison. Sandra's heart raced, and she instinctively clutched her Bible. She knew these were not ordinary people, but members of Madame Anaka's coven trying to influence the city's energy. She quickly ducked into a side alley, hoping to avoid being noticed. But as she turned the corner, a cold, familiar presence hit her like a wave. She turned, and there standing in the shadows was Madame Anaka herself. You can run, but you can't hide, Sandra, Madame Anaka sneered, stepping forward. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent energy, and her voice dripped with venom. You and your little teacher have been causing trouble, haven't you? Well, it ends now. Sandra's heart raced, but she refused to be intimidated. She stood tall, clutching her Bible tightly. You can't touch me. I belong to God, and he has already defeated you. Madame Anaka's smile widened. We'll see about that. Before Sandra could react, Anaka lifted her hand, and the air around them grew heavy, charged with dark energy. Sandra's legs weakened, and she felt the weight of the spiritual oppression press down on her. But then she remembered Mama F's words, and she raised her Bible high. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave. A brilliant light erupted from her Bible, and the dark energy surrounding Madame Anaka fizzled and cracked. The witch hissed in pain, stepping back as the light forced her back into the shadows. Not yet, Madame Anaka spat. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. With that, she vanished into the night, leaving Sandra standing in the alley, shaken but resolute. That evening, the prayer group gathered once again in Miss Shah's apartment, which had become their spiritual war room. Sandra shared the encounter with Madame Anaka, and everyone was on edge. The enemy was growing desperate, and they all knew that the next confrontation would be the most dangerous yet. Mama F stood up, her eyes fiery with determination. It's time to take the fight to Madame Anaka. We cannot wait for her to come to us. We will confront her and her coven, and we will break their power once and for all. But how? Sandra asked, fear creeping into her voice. We can't do this alone. No, Mama F said with a solemn nod. We're not alone. God has given us all the strength we need. We will pray, but we must also act. Tomorrow, we gather the believers in this city. We will create a wall of prayer around this place, and we will take a stand. Miss Shah nodded in agreement. We need to expose Madame Anaka for who she truly is, and show this city that the powers of darkness have no hold here. Sandra felt a surge of hope. I'm ready. Let's do this. The next morning, the prayer group began their preparations. Word spread quickly, and believers from across Badge Din City began gathering at Miss Shah's apartment, ready to take a stand against the dark forces that had plagued their city for so long. At the same time, Madame Anaka gathered her remaining coven members. She knew this battle would be decisive. This was the moment she had been waiting for. As the sun began to set, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The two forces, one of light, the other of darkness, prepared for a final showdown. Sandra stood with the prayer group, her heart filled with both fear and courage. She had seen firsthand the power of God, and now, more than ever, she knew it was time to fight for her city, her future, and her faith. The battle was about to begin. The evening air was thick with tension as the prayer group, led by Miss Shah and Mama F, gathered in the heart of Badge Din City. People filled the streets, some standing in silent prayer, others quietly whispering scriptures under their breath. Word had spread, and the city's believers had come together for one final stand against the darkness that had loomed over them for so long. Sandra, her heart pounding, stood at the front of the group, holding her Bible tightly. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the culmination of everything they had been through. The prayers, the battles, the fear. It all led to this final confrontation. Are you ready? Miss Shah asked, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Sandra nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. I'm ready. We have to do this. For the city. For everyone who's been hurt by this darkness. Mama F stepped forward, her face grave but determined. We are not alone. God has promised us victory, but we must stand firm in our faith. When we face Madame Anaka, we must remember that our power comes from him. Do not be afraid, for the battle belongs to the Lord. As the prayer group began to sing hymns of praise, the air around them shifted. Sandra felt a sudden coldness, a presence that made her skin prickle. Madame Anaka's coven was near. In the shadows of a nearby alley, Madame Anaka and her remaining coven members stood watching the growing crowd of believers. The energy in the air was thick with spiritual power, and Madame Anaka could feel it, a tremor of fear rippling through her. She had never expected this many people to come together against her. Her lips curled into a wicked smile. They think they can defeat me. They have no idea what they're dealing with. Her coven members stood silently, their faces obscured by hoods, their eyes gleaming with dark intent. But even they could sense the shift in the atmosphere. They had underestimated the strength of the light. Madame Anaka raised her arms, chanting under her breath, her words ancient and filled with dark power. The ground beneath them trembled as the shadows around them deepened. She called on the entity that had empowered her, the dark force that had fed on the fear and chaos of the city for years. It had given her power, but now it was demanding payment. You've betrayed me before, Anaka. The voice of the entity rumbled from the depths of the darkness. You failed me more than once. This time, there will be no mercy. Madame Anaka's eyes flashed with defiance. I will not fail. Tonight, I will bring this city to its knees. The shadows began to take shape, swirling around her like a storm, coalescing into a dark, towering figure. It was the embodiment of the evil force that had controlled Badge Din for generations. A massive shadow, its eyes burning with malevolent fire. Then go, the entity commanded. Destroy them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two forces converged. Sandra's heart pounded as she stood at the front of the prayer group, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of Madame Anaka and her coven. She felt the spiritual tension rise, a sense of impending doom pressing in on her. But she refused to give in. She knew God was with them, and they could not back down. Without warning, the first attack came. A gust of wind, dark and unnatural, swept through the crowd. The candles flickered, their flames barely holding against the dark energy. From the shadows, Madame Anaka emerged, her figure silhouetted against the eerie light. It's over, Madame Anaka called out, her voice booming with dark authority. "You cannot win. The darkness has already claimed this city. There is nothing you can do to stop it." Sandra took a step forward, her voice shaking but strong. "You're wrong. The light has already overcome the darkness. You're the one who's going to lose." With a shout, Madame Anaka extended her hands, and the dark figure behind her roared, its form writhing as it reached for the group. A wave of energy shot toward the prayer group, its power dark and crushing. The ground shook as the entity's malevolent force surged through the air. But just as the darkness neared, Sandra stepped forward, her Bible raised high. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." A brilliant flash of light erupted from her Bible, shining so brightly it was like a beacon in the darkness. The light slammed into the shadowy entity, causing it to writhe in pain. The dark force recoiled, but Madame Anaka pushed forward, her voice growing louder and more commanding. "Fight! All of you!" she shrieked, rallying her coven. The coven members raised their hands, summoning dark energy to counteract the light. The battle raged on both the physical and spiritual planes. As the believers prayed and sang, the ground around them seemed to vibrate with the power of their faith. Sandra could feel the presence of God surrounding them, filling her with a peace that surpassed understanding. But she also felt the weight of the darkness pressing against her, trying to extinguish the light. Madame Anaka's coven sent wave after wave of dark energy toward them, but each time the prayer group stood firm, raising their voices in praise and calling on the name of Jesus. Sandra could see the witch's fury growing, but she refused to back down. She remembered the words Mama F had shared with her. "We are not alone. God has already won the victory." A voice echoed in Sandra's mind. "Do not fear. You are mine, and I will fight for you." At that moment, the sky above seemed to split open, a torrent of light flooding the streets. The darkness faltered, shrinking away from the brilliance of God's presence. Sandra looked around in amazement as the members of the coven began to falter, their dark powers weakening. Madame Anaka's face twisted in frustration. "No, you cannot defeat me," she screamed. But the light continued to shine brighter, pushing back the shadows and revealing the truth. The people of Bedtime, united in faith, stood firm against the forces of darkness. As the battle intensified, Sandra felt a surge of strength. She closed her eyes, praying with all her heart. "God, give us victory. Break the chains. Free this city." In response, a mighty roar filled the air as the shadowy entity screamed in pain. The light from Sandra's Bible grew blinding, and in one final surge of power, the entity was shattered, its form disintegrating into nothingness. Madame Anaka staggered back, her power unraveling. "No!" she cried, her voice breaking as the last of her dark strength vanished. The coven members around her dropped to their knees, their faces pale and exhausted. Madame Anaka's eyes met Sandra's, and for the first time, there was fear in them. You've won." Sandra stood tall, her heart filled with peace. "It's not us. It's God, and He has already defeated you." With those final words, Madame Anaka crumpled to the ground, her power broken, her influence shattered. The darkness that had plagued Bedtime City for so long was finally gone. As the first light of dawn began to break over the city, the believers stood together, victorious. The battle was over, and the forces of darkness had been driven out. Bedtime City had been freed. Sandra looked around at the faces of those who had stood by her side. Miss Shah, Mama F, and the many others who had come together in faith. They had faced the greatest battle of their lives, and they had won. But Sandra knew this was only the beginning. "We've won the battle," she said quietly, "but the real work begins now. We must rebuild. We must restore." Miss Shah smiled warmly at her. "And we will. Together." As the city awoke to a new day, the light of hope filled the streets, dispelling the darkness that had once held them captive. And Sandra, now stronger and more resolute than ever, knew that as long as she stood in faith, the light would never fade.